This is vision 6. And we need to pair for ourselves a differential which is very significant. We're at a point in our education where we're looking ahead as much as we're remembering. Or to put it another way, because we are remembering, we can look ahead. One of the curious paradoxes of memory is that it allows foresight. There's no seeing ahead without memory. We tend to think of something like foresight as being imagination. But imagination, by its very name, deals with images. Imagination marshals images, and images have a referent which is primordially natural. The image of a tree has a natural referent in a tree. It was a famous problem in Plato's time. We each have different images of different trees. We also have different images of the same tree. We can also have the same image of different trees. We can teach ourselves to see some abstract tree. Is that the ultimate universal tree? And Plato's contention was that there must be a form tree, which has then variants which come into being. One time in the late 1940s in Canada, the CBC sent a team into the far northern territories to the Inuit people, to the Eskimo peoples. And they were getting interested in Eskimo art, especially the Holman Island conclave that produced such great Eskimo engravings, Pitsialak and her crew. And in the late 40s, the crew asked the Eskimos to draw images of a tree, and none of them had ever seen a tree in their lives. There are no trees in the tundra. On Baffin Island, there are no trees. And the trees were abstract, sharp stick shapes. They were Jacques-Comedy bushes, burnt out cinders. So then they took this population of people and showed them films of forests. But they filmed not the film of the forest, but they filmed the people seeing a forest for the first time. And they were dumbfounded. They were awestruck. And then the film changed, and instead of there being a forest on the screen, there was the Toronto skyline. And the reaction from the Inuit people was nothing. It was nil. It was blank. It didn't register to them. They had no conception that human habitation could be on the scale of a Toronto skyline. It was an abstract design that had no meaning for them whatsoever. It's only through memory that we can see ahead, because it's only through memory that consciousness is able to engender creatively. We tend to think that there is such a thing as creative imagination. But the term creative imagination is two words. It's two things brought together. We think imaginative, something is imaginative, that it's creative. Disney Imagineering, imaginative engineering. All of this sloughs over. Very fundamental point. But this point is not resolvable in terms of etymology, in terms of linguistics, even in terms of a pro and con discussion about the ideas and the functions, but it becomes resolvable, like many other issues, when our education is used as a template. When the phase, form, development of how we come to participate in the world which is here for us, we're able to understand and say. And we saw in the first year of our education that there is a seasonal cycle that comes together and forms as a cycle a pattern of integration. It begins with nature. We found that no other beginning is workable. Any other beginning than nature actually produces more problems than resolutions and offers no traction. If we begin like Descartes with I think, therefore I am, we get caught in a paradoxical conundrum. Nature was a beginning point, but not a point so much. We found that nature was an ongoing emergent process, constantly emergent, and we used as an example for ourselves, just to get going, the ancient Chinese appreciation of nature as a matrix of change. That what really is going on in nature is a matrix of change. It's a process. It's not static, it's not objective, it is emergent. And we paired with the I Ching Thoreau, especially Thoreau's little essays on walking or on taking a winter's walk, separated by about 10 years in his work, sections of the journal. We took Thoreau's appreciation of a movement, a personal movement, our own movement in our own neighborhood, walking around where we live, as a pair to this matrix of change, which is the process of nature. And we found that we could at least begin there. And we found that nature finds its objectivity in a ritual comportment, which in its most intense can be characterized as existence. That existence, existent objectivity, focuses because one has an integration there which is repeatable, it has a periodicity, it has a factorable quality which goes back into the process of change, but that factorable quality which goes back into the process of change also equally well goes into a process which turns out to be language. And that language is like a process indexing of the existential quality of comportment, focusing in things, in objects. To put it simply, the movement of nature likes to come into focus in things, likes to manifest. It likes to make quarks, it likes to make electrons, it likes to make muons, which then need to be into atomic structures, which need to come together in molecules, which eventually result in us, and we are objectively here. Not as targets for some game of pin the tail on the donkey, but we're here objectively because our focus of activity, our focus of ritual comportment ensures that our objectivity has some kind of a resonant focus in this process of change. And so we saw in the first year that nature and ritual are linked together. Language is linked together with ritual, the mythic level of process linked with ritual, so that nature, ritual, and myth, forming this kind of integral pattern, come to a fruition in symbols. And that symbols are powerful in that they are also objective. That ritual can be said to, for us, to focus objectively in the body, and our body is quite real in terms of existential comportment. And just so, the mind is objectively quite real in its symbolic integration. So that nature, ritual, myth, and symbol formed a great quaternary, a great square. But we saw, towards the end of last year and the beginning of this year, just a few weeks ago, that this process, this movement, this clockwise like winding up, doesn't come to a screeching halt. It doesn't even come to a T.S. Eliot whimpering disappearance, but it comes to a very dramatic implosion. In fact, the original syntactical sense of symbol in Greek was that it's thrown together. There's an implosive dimension to the integration. It doesn't just slide neatly into place, but collides into place. Like a bevatron or a tevatron, the symbol becomes a dynamic objectivity. And that dynamic objectivity has a further functioning that comes out of this. That what wound itself up now unwinds itself. And just as there was a four-part cycle to integration, there's also a four-part cycle to differentiation. And that differentiation has its own phase form, wholeness, its own quaternary. And we've seen so far that vision is the beginning of that. An inner seeing from the mind. That there is the process of nature and the process of myth become integrated. That somehow the images of myth and the change of nature become not only integrated but matrixed so that they function in an integrated whole that has the ability to have a resonant quality to it. And this resonance is like a medium of foresight which goes out. And so vision results in what we would call colloquially as consciousness. And one can say, well, certainly the mind is conscious in symbols. But one must be careful there. Because consciousness is also a process. Is a process so that vision is very much like nature or like myth. It has a process quality rather than an objective quality. It does objectivize. It can be objectified. It has the ability to be rounded up and rounded off, but one has to bring in other phases, other functions, other objectivity phases, other objective functions in order to do this. So that vision as a process, consciousness as a process, has a great parallel quality with the way in which language as a process operates, and which nature as a process operates. And now at Vision 6, we can look pretty far ahead, and we can see that there's another process that happens. That in the differential cycle, just as in the integral cycle there were two processes, nature and language, in the differential cycle there are two processes. One is vision, the other is history. And history is such an arcane process. It's as developed from vision as myth is from nature. The development of language is protean, like nature, but is several orders. beyond or above, deeper. One able to master language can tease direction out of nature. One can use words to such an extent. The great American poet Wallace Stevens wrote in one of his poems of the natural matrix, he said, "Thou art not august unless I, saying, make thee so." In Stevens' poem, the idea of order at Key West, the woman walking alongside the seashore, the poet and his friend up on the bluffs, and they hear her singing, walking alongside the seashore, and suddenly the two men turn to each other and they realize that she's singing about the sea. And that as she sings, how does Stevens say it? She sang beside the sea, and the sea, whatever self it had, became the self that was her song, and she singing made. Among the meaningless plungings of the waves, however tall, in theatrical distances, the amphitheater of her poem gave it the self which it then became. And he turns to his friend and he says, "I've come to realize that this is what we do. That reality is protean. It has so many jewel-like facets because there are so many different individual singers. And that we create what in Vajrayana Buddhism is called the jewel matrix universe. The Avatam Saka Sutra, which is a huge thing. Myth has to do, language has to do with experience. It's that horizon where experience parallels nature. And as experience and nature parallel each other, there's an integral paralleling inclusiveness where experience is able to dovetail with nature. But in the differential cycle, the differential phases very often work in an inverse way to the integral. And if not put into a synthesizing whole so that they're ratioable, they become polarities. So that in very archaic times, when human beings would discover the process of consciousness juicing in their lives, coursing in their veins, being available to them, they noticed that the more that they brought a conscious process into play, the less that nature was in play. And so one of the very early terms from ancient Iran for consciousness was a term from those individuals who specialized in developing this, the magi, and so the process that we know as consciousness was called magic. And magic was a supernatural phenomenon. And the more that magic came into play, the less that nature was in play. And there was a danger, there was a peril, because one could bring magic into play to such an extent that it began to be over 50%, it would begin to eclipse nature. And all of the gratis, axiomatic help that nature gave as a contextualizing would dissolve, and suddenly there were these responsibilities and problems for the practitioner of the magic. They would have to take over. They would have to consciously do it. Instead of just breathing involuntarily, they would now have to regulate their breath. and so on through the whole range, the entire spectrum of natural functions. In India, this brought forth the yogi, who began to understand that as you bring consciousness forth, the body then becomes subject not just to autonomic natural processes, but can be eclipsed by a conscious direction. And that one then has to be conscious of the natural functioning in rather structural detail. That there isn't just the simple breathing in and breathing out. There isn't just the simple pair of inhaling and exhaling. But upon yogic concentration, one sees that there is a threshold, a point, as it were, in the process of breathing, where one ceases to breathe in, and just before you breathe out, there's a stopping point. There's a turning point. It's very difficult to breathe in and out at the same time. There is a turning point, there's a threshold. But that occurs as a pair, because there's a point where one ceases to breathe out, and just before you breathe in, there's another point, another threshold. And that inner threshold, that inner point of equanimity between breathing functions, has a complement out here. And one can extend both those moments. And in a yogic process, one can make a complete quaternary. One can breathe in an equal duration to holding the equanimity inside with no breathing whatsoever, and then breathe out in equanimous proportion, and then hold that out here, so that one has a quaternary of the whole process of breathing consciously. One then sees that one has a pair of pairs again. Then one understands that the whole respiratory cycle has an integral conscious quality that's able to be indexed and creatively brought into, instead of an emphasis on just the natural pair of breathing in and out, one has the conscious or supranatural pair of equanimities, so-called within and out. And it doesn't take much yogic experience at all, or contemplative experience, to see that in equanimities between pairs, one can exchange presence. The yogi who has the phase of equanimity within can exchange that with an equanimity without, quite easily. Just as easily as breathing in, pausing for a moment, and then breathing in some more, by carrying it over. There is in consciousness then a dimension. There is in differentiation a dimension which begins to recut the whole cycle of nature. Doesn't have to recut it, but can. Can not only recut, but can redesign. And when one takes the designing function, or the redesigning function, and bundles that, couples that with the foresight function, one then comes to see that the process of history is radically different from the process of myth. Myth has to do with experience. History has to do with experiment. It's a foresight that consciousness choreographs into new structure, and we try it out. There's such a thing as a historical vision. Become very powerful. Whole landscapes of nature can be devastated by historical vision that just simply has its own purposes. And it takes a great reminder that the forests are important, the seas are important. In our time, it comes as an enormous surprise to hear reports from mariners, merchant marine people who sail the wide oceans and who come upon flotsam and jetsam in the streams and the oceans the world round. With the little plastic bottles are floating out thousands of miles from any shore. That the stream beds in the ocean, the Gulf Stream and so forth, are carriers of pollution to the whole planet. One has to realize that historical vision can be so powerful as to obliterate the naturalness of the oceans of the planet. Well, one can see that a star system is not safe. Even a whole raft of stars in an arm of a galactic structure are not safe, unless one begins to realize that there has to be a complementation. One has to take this powerful capacity of a historical vision and make sure that the language and natural processes are brought into play so that one has a large sense of the real. But what complicates it even more is that just as experience on the mythic level is able to engender a mind which can objectify in symbols the meaning into powerful ideas that are really objectively there. Ideas are so objective that they have a life history. They have form which can just stamp its shape not only upon a landscape, but on whole populations of people. History, with its experimental quality, is the foundation, is the process out of which science comes. And science is such a cosmic objectivity, really powerful, tremendously there. And so our education now, in vision, is beginning to look ahead with foresight and to say that we have our hands full. That the whole first year in education came very nicely to a point of equanimity, to a point of interiorization of meaning, to a point that can be done with such comprehension and such elegance as to constitute a rest. That the only place in the whole natural ecology where real stillness occurs is at the very center of the human mind. One can come to that place of rest. And one finds in the great symbolic literatures of mankind, again and again, the great religions, the great philosophies, the utter humility at being able to participate in such a triumph, and being able to bring into one's life, into one's body, one's mind, this capacity of coming to equanimity. And so it comes as rather a rude awakening. It's like a morning after, that all of this has consequence. Because the more powerful the equanimity, the more powerful the rest, the more powerful the symbols gain their objectivity in the mind, the more they have a dynamic resonance that plays itself out into the natural processes, plays itself out into the processes of language. So that the objective forms that come out of differential consciousness begin to have such a presence, such an objective presence, that their resonance begins to have an interface or an interference. One gets to have the kind of quality where a planet in orbit around a star a planet which generates its own magnetic field, and that magnetic field comes into an interface with the magnetic field of the star, and one gets a bow shock of the planet. That leads the planet out, and one gets a hyperbolic curve. That bow shock is so real that it has a sound. A couple of years ago at JPL, they made a little whistle that was tuned to the sound of the bow shock of our planet in our star system. And you could blow this little whistle and you could hear in miniature the sound of the planet in orbit around our star. And that in fact, the planets all have this kind of bow shock capacity so that one could have, unbelievably, one has to rub one's mental eyes, one could have the old Pythagorean notion of a harmony of the spheres because each planet has its own note, and the set of notes making a great octave makes this quality there, a harmony, a chord of sound which our star system has. If one includes Pluto and Charon as a planet, as well we probably should, we have the old Plutonian Aeneid. And of course, if one gets very nimble in one's nuances of inclusion, integration, one includes the star itself and one has the Pythagorean 10. Interesting star system. That a pair of fives, a double 5, a 10 characterizes the actual musical mechanics of the whole celestial orbital choreography of our star system. Now, there's no way to imagine that without memory coming into play and giving us a foresight, ability to have a field of creative inquiry that allows for imagination to sketch and play experimentally in that way. And so memory has a radically different kind of quality from imagination. And it isn't at all the very simple quality which the Romans assumed, that memory is arranging things in the mind. That's very low level of considering what memory is. That there's something protean and creative and conscious about memory as a function. One of the great focuses, as we've seen from one of the books that we're using, Francis Yates, The Art of Memory, one of the great focuses of all of these issues together, of all of the curious points of inquiry, the evocative ideas that one could bring out, the entire ensemble tied with a bow is in the figure of Shakespeare. That Shakespeare is like this well-wrapped favorite package, and all one needs to do is to open this up, and the entire panorama of the gifts of conscious differentiation are there. Where would one find the bow on Shakespeare? The plays are in the present. What wrapped the present? What was the bow that tied it? The bow was the theater, appropriately named the Globe. The Globe of the company. What was Shakespeare's company? Originally the Lord Chamberlain's men, but finally when James came in, the King's men. The globe was the spherical world, the entire world. What's so great about that? What's so tremendous? We live in such an international, global world, and we forget how completely, radically new that it was 400 years ago. When the globe was constructed in 1599, it was like a triumphant, visionary accomplishment that just staggered the conscious world. The realization of what man had come to be able to do. And one can go back in historical precedent a long ways or just a very short way, and taking a cue from the Elizabethans themselves. One only needs to go back about 29, 30 years before that. In 1570, a little slim book, the translation of it into modern print, and actually they printed the old edition with a new introduction. It's just a few pages. It's an introduction to the elements of geometry of the most ancient philosopher, Euclid, by John Dee. John Dee, who was at that time the mathematical genius of Europe, of England. In Dee's little introduction to the elements of Euclid, one finds for the first time a reasoned, conscious argument for the making of a tremendous fleet of ships that could navigate the entire globe. That the entire globe of the planet was available for development. Out of this comes that song, Rule Britannia, Britannia rules the waves. Wherever the waves of the oceans of the world wash ashore, that's meat for the Englishman's commercial vision. It isn't the development by the Portuguese of the ladder and sail that makes such a difference in global navigation, global shipping, the distribution of a center of humanity over the entire planet, but it's the development of Dee, of the art of navigation, the mathematics of how you do it, of how you go from one point to another on an actual globe, because the world is spherical. And it's very difficult to navigate if your mind is still on two-dimensional table maps. If your mathematics is still glued to a two-dimensional imaginative form in the mind, you're not going to be able to navigate very well. Just like in the Apollo program of going to the moon in the 1960s. The American mathematicians had to get out of a spherical, global, three-dimensional trigonometric effort that was initiated by John Dee in 1570. It's the first time anybody knew the mathematics of how to trigonometrically navigate a globe. In the 1960s, the American mathematicians had to understand that to get to the moon, you have to get off the globe. You have to go into celestial mechanics that involve a lot more dimensional complex than just trigonometric functions. One had to go into very, very highfalutin math. And when one looks at the Apollo programs that involve flights to the moon, there's almost infinite frames of reference that have to be indexed all the time, split second. And that one cannot just simply mechanically go there, because the there that's here is constantly moving, and the there that's there is constantly moving. And while one's going, all of this is moving in many different ways. Not only is the Earth going around the star, but the Earth and the star themselves are actually in a paired ballet around the barycenter, which is the real solar system, which if you don't know and you don't take in your computations, 1/100th of a degree off and you're gone forever. You don't hit anything. Next stop is the great nebula of Andromeda. You got 2 million years at the speed of light. You better have a lunch. But the whole star system itself is moving. Because the whole family of stars, the 50 or 60 stars that make our family of stars, are a section that has a certain point in this hyperbolic curve of the arm of the Milky Way in which we are, that is making a very special little sachet around a point, and it's very hard to compute because the galaxy's only turned 9 times since it congealed. And that guys and gals sitting in little huts in Seabrook, Texas could figure that out 30 years, 40 years ago, and understand that one had to get galactic mechanics down accurately enough to be able to factor that into the computation, and that's how you can get to the moon. But in 1570, the big problem was how to get from one place to another on the globe with predictability. And it was Dee's introduction to the elements of geometry that did it. Why did he take Euclid? Euclid is 300 BC. That's 1900 years before. Because Euclid's geometry still held, because Euclid did his geometry right. And as we said before, if you look at the elements of Euclid, it's published still. Dover paperbacks, 3 volumes. The very first sentence of Euclid, he discloses that all geometry begins with a point, and a point has no dimensions. And if you begin with a point of no dimension, if you have a focus which has no dimensions, you can then generate out of it dimensionality beginning with 1 dimension. And it's very important, it turns out in later, very late 20th century mathematics, that in order to understand knot theory, a knot is a self-avoiding 1-dimensional vector in a 3-dimensional space. There's no Alexander the Great way of severing a knot with one bold stroke, of going where man has never gone before. You can't do that. But you can learn to surf a 1-dimensional self-avoiding vector well enough to influence a tangent out of it. And like any good 21st century yogi, one learns to do this so that the knots of the mind are no longer a problem. One gets the periodicity of the complexity, picks the crest wave of the neurosis, and rides it out. It sounds rather like Star Trek. Scotty, beam me up. John Dee's introduction, mathematical introduction to Euclid's elements in 1570, set up the whole symbol of the globe as being a navigable whole for man. And so when they built the theater that was to be for Shakespeare, his place of talking about navigable man in terms of the real, they called it the globe. Let's take a break and come back. So there is a globe, and again, Bankside, London, there is a globe. The theater is rebuilt now. And in 1997, one could go to see a production of Shakespeare again in the rebuilt Globe Theater. It exists again. It's there. In Frances Yates' The Art of Memory, she writes this at a time when the globe was not fully realizable, was not buildable. And it was only later, after this book, and in fact, in a sequel to The Art of Memory, in a book called Theater of the World, which has a frontispiece of John Dee, Frances Yates takes The Art of Memory further And she goes into the development of the way in which the Roman architect Vitruvius, the Vitruvian ideal of structure, began to, I think the word that should be used is obtrude, began to obtrude itself in the 1500s, in the 16th century. I say obtrude because the Vitruvian architectural structure is the structure of imperial Rome, is a very powerful, visualizable, doable architectural template. One must remember quite accurately and clearly that the most powerful man of his time, Augustus Caesar, who made the Roman Empire what it was, made the imperial mythology stick, who commissioned Virgil and who commissioned one of his very close military advisors, a man named Agrippa, who was also a very talented engineer and architect, to build the Pantheon, the temple of all the gods. That Rome doesn't own just its god, but it owns all the gods. All of the gods of the world are ours. We are blessed. Our power is universal, characteristic. And so the great dome of the Pantheon was also a symbol. One finds, for instance, classic monograph here by E. Baldwin Smith, The Dome, A Study in the History of Ideas, published by Princeton University Press. And this itself followed by Smith's great volume on architectural symbolism of imperial Rome in the Middle Ages, how it carried all the way. And one reads these kinds of excerpt sentences. Remember now, we're talking about a time period of many, many centuries. The time from Agrippa's building of the Pantheon for Augustus to the building of the Globe Theater is almost 1,600 years. So we're talking about an impress on human lives and human history, which is all but shattering. We still feel the reverberations today. Part of it is because of this universal need and desire of Augustus, and because of him, of the Imperium, and because of that, of the Roman Empire, to bring into forms, into symbolic forms in the mind, which then would be projected out in consciousness, forms that would be everlasting. And so they integrated into it all of the value vectors that they could lay their hands on, all of the meaning that the world had. And so one reads this kind of sentence in Smith's, under the chapter, The City Gate Concept. It is not only in the Old Testament references to the coming of the Lord, which reflect the influence of the royal epiphany upon men's imagery. Throughout the empire and the Middle Ages, many of the most lasting symbolic ideas associated with the gateway and the ruler worship ritual were derived from the elaborate ceremonies with which the cities of the Hellenistic and Roman East welcomed their rulers at the gateway as a resplendent sun god, a universal master of heaven and earth, and a savior, destined, it was hoped, to bring peace, prosperity, and happiness to their adoring subjects. And so one has the great Roman architectural idea of the triumphal arch, one of the arches that still survives, 1997, in the center of today's Rome. The Great Arch of Titus, And one is astounded, one is astonished when one looks at this great Roman triumphal arch, Titus, who became a Roman emperor, whose father, Vespasian, was a Roman emperor, whose despotic brother, Domitian, was a Roman emperor, the whole family. The whole Flavian family who displaced the Caesars. The whole Caesar line came to an end in Vespasian, ushered in a new Flavian dynasty of Roman emperors. And where did he usher it in? In Alexandria. He learned to be a savior in Alexandria. In Alexandria, he learned, because it was whispered to him, that the world was waiting for a Messiah who could do miracles, could make the blind see and the lame walk. And Vespasian performed these miracles himself in Alexandria. He made the blind see. He made the lame walk. He was the Messiah. Amazingly, he took over the Roman Empire on that basis. And to cement it, to make sure that he had it and no one else had it, he sent his son, Titus, to destroy Jerusalem, which was the only competition available. And it was Titus who leveled the city of Jerusalem, who obliterated it, they thought, from history. The Romans by that time had a lot of experience in doing this. They had almost 300 years of doing this. We talked a couple of months ago about how at the end of the Second Punic War, the Hannibalic Wars, where Carthage was vying with Rome, and finally when Roman power under the aegis of Scipio Africanus became just a military juggernaut, that the Roman Senate demanded that Carthage be obliterated from the world. That they were not just defeated, but they were going to be excised, obliterated from history. Well, that the Roman army brought in a population of hundreds of thousands of slaves, and in about a year's time, they uprooted the foundations of every building in Carthage and dumped the blocks into the sea, and that the site of classical Carthage today is a salt swamp. It's been so for 2,300 years. Some of the more delicate Roman voices at the time were afraid. This kind of planned savagery was something new. It wasn't just defeating an enemy. It was obliterating every trace of them forever from history. And so when Titus destroyed Jerusalem, the Romans had a lot of experience in doing this. And Jerusalem obliterated, they took the center symbol of Jerusalem and they put it in the center of the Arch of Titus in the center of Rome. The great menorah that was in the temple in Jerusalem. They've been put there by Solomon 1,000 years before. But the Romans did something which only Roman military savagery could do. They didn't put the object itself there. They didn't put the menorah itself there. They put an image of the menorah in their arch. Their arch was real. Their menorah was now an image co-opted into our architecture. Do you understand? Whatever your reality is can be encapsulated in an image which we then own. You have no way to come back from any dimension of salvation because we own your image. Even if you did come back, you'd come back into our image. We would sue the hell out of you. Do you understand the massive viciousness? But it goes farther than that. A triumphal arch is the gateway. It's the welcoming of the Savior back to the city of power. The proscenium of the stage is like a gateway, like a triumphal arch. It's very important. But there's something even architecturally more potent than ever, and that is that the triumphal arch becomes three-dimensional. It doesn't just run in a two-dimensional way, but has the crisscross of two triumphal arches coming together and making a dome. Hence the dome, hence the Pantheon. Hence, when one looks at the Gothic cathedral ceiling, one sees intersecting triumphal arches. One sees this great quaternary. But always in evolution, there is this undercurrent of complementation, and if stretched to a breaking point of polarization. Even at the end of the Cretaceous age, where the great dinosaurs were dying out, the little furtive mammal shrews were still living. And so while the ultimate triumph was there with Roman Catholic power, underneath it all, on the floor of those cathedrals, popular folk traditions were leaking in. The village peasant level buffoonery was leaking in. And if you have control over 100% of the power, you let people have their little crust of foolishness. Let the peasants have their little moments of fun. Well, they can have this at the most favored time of the year was Easter. It wasn't the almighty somber birth. It was like a rebirth. It was like a time when everything was in transition and there was something coming out anew. And so in Easter ceremonies in the Middle Ages, these great Roman power cathedrals where everything was mastered, all the logic, all the music, everything was mastered. Little skits by villagers would be played out on the floors of the cathedrals in little huts that they would make together. And one gets absolutely astounded. One gets speechless. One sees in the projection of these little tiny huts of the peasants, one remembers one has seen these kinds of huts before. At the very root of Roman Christian tradition, it's still all built upon a kind of a Jewish symbolism, and the little huts are like the Sukkoth booths that are there in Feast of Tabernacles. That the peasants somehow got the fact that one of the most fundamental observances of this is the participation of the people, of the little people. And that they favor these little skits, these little episodes, little dramatic episodes. And out of those episodes of village buffoonery on the floors of the cathedrals, over many hundreds of years, built this slowly evolving complexity of the miracle play cycles. So when one has a universal cosmic individual like Shakespeare writing great plays, he puts in little skits of buffoonery right in the middle. Pyramus and Thisbe in A Midsummer Night's Dream is the first time that the young Shakespeare got it. His friend Richard Burbage was telling him one time over some ale about how his father, James Burbage, had built this very interesting theater in London. And I think it was called the Red Lion Theater because of the alchemical process that somehow drama distills the audience from where they were into some new kind of form, transforms the audience. takes them out of their everyday world and puts them into a dramatic world, not only of dramatic imagination, but evokes out of them a memory of something beneath the surface that's never been touched or tampered with. Some kind of archetypal level that comes back out full blown, and people wake up, they remember. But they're not just stupid artisans, but they're universal spirits who belong in a universe that has more than 5 dimensions. That drama can do this. And it was because of James Burbage's example that the whole motive, idea was developed of building the globe. And A Midsummer Night's Dream is Shakespeare's coming of age. It's his way of writing the play that showed, yeah, I can do it now. Let's build a theater. Because we can bring the drama to the transformative point where the refining fire gets rid of all the dross, and what's left there after the performance is an audience that goes out from the theater and carries with them at least the seeds of a kinesthetic realization that there are more possibilities than anyone ever dreamed of or ever told you. There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in all your philosophies or religious doctrines. There are no ceilings, there are no walls, and there are no floors that human beings can fly. This kind of quality was there, and one finds it. And when we come to, in 3 weeks, to the next phase of vision, we'll bring in Shakespeare, one of his plays. Not the first one, Midsummer Night's Dream, where one finds great sets of books in university libraries around the world of the sources and analogs of Shakespeare. And when it comes to Midsummer Night's Dream, they finally all say, well, the guy must have thought it up himself. Oh, it must have come from the man. Or maybe it wasn't Shakespeare. Midsummer Night's Dream comes from the man. It's when someone, an artist, gets it for himself, there's a great pleasure in doing his stuff, putting it out. And right at the end of his dramatic career, Shakespeare's The Tempest is the great summation of that. It's like the great resonant pair, whereas Midsummer Night's Dream is an integral, wonderful dream. It's the apotheosis of the myth interiorized to a symbolic realization. The Tempest is the great conscious complement to it. It's the development of someone who is conscious of magical powers in historical processes that realizes that you can make cosmos, but you have to use human personality as the calipers. Otherwise, it goes into regressive, de-evolutionary spirals where maybe even the demons become real. And Prospero understands in The Tempest that there comes a point where even if you could still use that magic language, you keep your silence. You keep your silence because a new, younger generation is coming and they need to experiment. And though you could make any kind of world you wanted for them, they have a right to have the world that they discover by their own experiment, but they are free. Even to the point that they have the right to make their own mistakes. And Prospero learns, like a parent must learn, to let the child go. They have their own life. They have the right to make their mistakes. They have the right to their triumphs. And so Shakespeare in The Tempest will use the Tempest. And to find a pair to the Tempest is very difficult. And the pair that I chose is Shelley's great drama Prometheus Unbound. It took a long time for some writer to come along who could use the English language like Shakespeare with that kind of protean universal quality. Shakespeare's working language is about 50,000 words. The recognition span of newspaper reader today is about 5,000 words. Shakespeare played in a vocabulary of about 10 times the size of the modern literate reader. Shelley was on that scale. His language is on that scale. And Prometheus Unbound, like The Tempest, is a good pair for it. It is a visionary capacity of language that's brought to focus in the person. When one looks to find how The Tempest holds its matrix, one finally learns to see that it's the Shakespeare behind The Tempest that emerges. As Louis Sullivan once said to the young Frank Lloyd Wright, he said, behind every building that you see is an architect that you don't see. And when the architecture holds together, has its triple Platonic ideal, it has the unum, it has the unity, it has the bonum, it has the excellence, the good of it, and it has the ends, it has the being, it has oomph. When a building has all three of those together, what comes out of that is the architect, is there. You could take yourself to Northern California, to Marin County sometime, to the Civic Center, one of Wright's last projects. You can stand there and admire the architectural forms of the building and look at the arches and the flow, the streamlining, the continuity, the Buckminster Fuller-like tensegrity of the whole thing. But the building comes alive when you walk in it, because the pace of walking, about 2 miles an hour, at that pace the building unfolds its wings and one feels the architect. Frank Lloyd Wright is there in the building as you walk through it, because the whole building becomes alive. Or one goes to, say, one of Wright's projects like in Dallas, the Kalita Humphreys Theater. And you can stand there and look at it. And the building is very interesting. It's an architectural, interesting building. It's kind of odd angles until one gets it that all of the angles, every angle in the building is 30 degrees. Everything is cut like a jeweled facet of 30 degrees. And when one gets that visionary idea and one carries that mnemoniccally alive, and you walk through the Kalita Humphreys Theater looking 30-degree angles all the time, one begins to get an almost iridescent glow inside of one's visionary capacity. And you realize that it's a jewel of such a size that one could walk around in it, one could give drama in it. And one remembers the globe of Shakespeare recut into a late 20th century jewel of the Kalita Humphreys Theater. That Wright was such a great architect that he could make a living jewel wherein dramas could be presented. And so consciousness can refine itself in art to such an extent as to almost stagger the ability to even exhaust the possibility of human beings on the tribal level, who never even have seen that there's a depth to a jewel that one could make a building to be like a jewel within which one could have universal dramas. It's like the Eskimos who had never seen a tree. It misimagined a tree, but they couldn't even recognize a city. And so our capacities have to be nurtured, have to be matured, and that's what an education is for. Is to grow us through all of the capacity, all the phases that we have in our real possibilities, so that we don't inadvertently kneel down to somebody's triumphal arch because they're powerful. It's dangerous because they sign the paychecks. The quality of the little people enacting their little buffoonery, their little skits, for centuries on the floors of the great Romanesque and finally Gothic churches, settled and distributed down to an archetypal form. One finds in an old Yale University Press study, the Tudor drama, C.F. Tucker Brooke. One finds in here a beautiful little diagram facing page 4 of the floor of a cathedral. And it's little sites of medieval episodes, and when one looks at them at the list, they are numbered here and they go from 1 to 22. The first one is the first door, is the portal, the entrance. The 22nd is heaven. 22 images. One thinks back to the major arcana of like the tarot deck, or one thinks to many other kinds of orders. One thinks in terms of, let's say, a more advanced mathematical mnemonic. Let's think in terms of Georg Cantor's development of that led to set theory. If one thinks not of 22, but one thinks in 3 sets of 7 embedded in a 22nd, which is the matrix, translation of that in terms of tarot card arcana, the Fool card is blown up to huge size, and the 21 other major arcana numbered cards are arranged in 3 sets of 7 on top of it. One now has a zero-based matrix which has 3 sets of 7, that there's a 7 sequence repeated 3 times, or that a 7 sequence is cubed. Why would a 7 sequence be so powerful? Because the cosmology for 1600 years was 7 spheres. The sun, the moon, and the 5 planets. Universal. Ptolemaic world view, held even by Dante. All within an unmoving 8th sphere of the fixed stars. Fixed stars were as close as Roman and medieval imagination could get to a zero-base algorithm. They couldn't imagine. Imagination, in fact, can't get there. One has to use very highfalutin mnemonic because the zero rest doesn't occur in nature. It occurs only at the center of the mind. You have to be able to get to the center of the mind before that can be real. It takes a long time. There are no little master yogis that are running around in the shrubs. It has to be matured very slowly. It's like an apex, it's like an implosive conclusion to the entire integration cycle. Then one for first time has zero. Then one for first time has this rest, has equanimous presence, which is memorable. Not memorable as an image because it doesn't have any imagery whatsoever. That's why it's zero. It is exactly, precisely zero. Has no images, has no cardinal proportionality. You can't say that it's 1, it's before 1. The first person to ever say it in those terms was Philo of Alexandria. He said, God exceeds the initial unity of the world. is there before, while, and after. Because Philo was able to read Euclid quite comprehensively. But he was able to read Euclid in the time of Augustus Caesar. He got that the Romans, with all their imperial power, didn't get that God cannot be counted among man's things. That man's sequence of things never includes God, even on an image level. You can't make an icon of God and then have that thing and then include that in your order. Not only does it not work, but your belief that that's working turns out to be a schizophrenic disbelief that skews off your functioning the longer that it goes on. The more that you believe that you have an image of the divine, the less contact you have with anything divine. And the more that your belief becomes an abstraction that skews off completely more and more abstract until it comes into nonsense. The scholastic nonsense was recognized about in the 1080s. The most astute mind of the time, St. Anselm, the most refined scholastic logician of his day. But in his personal poetry, one finds images like images of Jesus as one's mother, of a man, a divine man being one's mother. Because Anselm was able to poke his logical excellence all the way through his scholastic dream and to touch something that was the complete opposite, but nevertheless was archetypally real. So that when someone who is intelligent, like Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, completely able to understand Anselm's logic, follow it very, very well. When he ran across someone like Hildegard of Bingen, whose visionary portrayals of Jesus as a mothering quality in visionary reality, he paid attention to her, didn't write her off, corresponded with her for decades. Yet encouraged her, put down what you need to say. And one finds here in the Civias of Hildegard of Bingen, one finds in her great work here a whole series of chapters. They make a book this thick, over 500 pages of print in English, the series of visions. And because she's working under an archetypal, visionary patterning, she has 13 visions. 12 visions for what can be counted, and a 13th vision for the figure that is the matrix within which the 12 occur. The 12 apostles, but they're 12 apostles of a Messiah. But when she begins here, she begins vision 1. God enthroned shows himself to Hildegard. So the first vision doesn't count in what one call the visions. It's very short. Vision 1 of Hildegard makes the matrix within which the other visions will come, and one can then count them. One can start counting at 1, but it's a misnumeral. The second vision is actually the first. And when one looks at the title, what is the title of vision 2? Creation. And the 13th vision, Symphony of the Blessed. So one gets here this kind of a matrix which cannot be numbered, yet it counts in the visionary order. And within that are the series that counts. on the floor of the cathedral, it's 22 stations, the first of which is the first door, the last of which, heaven, one cannot count. It's there, but it's the matrix of all. So that one goes for the first 22, one comes to the first door, and the 21st is the Holy Sepulchre. What's the Holy? The Holy Sepulchre is the place of burial, the coffin, the sarcophagus. But the whole point, if you remember from symbols, the whole point of a sarcophagus was that the Greek word sarcophagus means body eater. If you put a human physical body in a limestone sarcophagus, eventually the limestone will absorb the flesh, the bones, and everything. After enough hundreds or thousands of years, it doesn't really take that long, there will be nothing in the sarcophagus. It will be empty. So that one could go back later and confirm for oneself that this body, so much the foundation of existential objectivity in time-space, vanishes into zero, empty nothingness. So that the tomb, rather than being a dead-end period, is actually a very esoteric comma. Whole other cycle is beyond that. A cycle of afterlife. Cycle of conscious, magical afterlife, which then has to be taken into account. But because it cannot be counted in the natural cycle, it has to be, all of it has to be given a designation 0. Or when men and women became used to this, they discovered that logically one can give it a designation not only of 0, but its pair, infinity. Because infinity works, it factors, it operates with equanimous exactness to 0 in any expression that one uses. Logically, 0 and infinity are interchangeable. So that one learned to see the empty sarcophagus, the empty tomb, as a focus of a rebirth elsewhere, other times, other dimensions, afterlife, so that the tomb became a transforming womb, a womb of rebirth. And by the time of the miracle play skits of the very lucid, canny peasants of the Middle Ages, they understood that Easter was the very appropriate time to have skits that led to the empty Holy Sepulchre. And of course, they remembered such very little esoteric things, details that we lose today in the cacophony of ground out learning. We lose the little fine points, like in the Gospel of John. It's the only first-hand account that we have of visiting the tomb of Jesus. That Mary Magdalene comes and says to the disciples, "They've taken him. The tomb is empty. They stole his body." "What?" cries Peter, and he runs. And as he runs, a little boy who's only about 14 years old at the time, named John, who becomes St. John, he's only 14 years old, runs faster than Peter, who's in his late 50s and sort of lumbering a little bit. And the first one to arrive at the sepulchre after Mary Magdalene says it's empty is St. John, who remembers as an old man, writes it in the Gospel. He says, the tomb was empty. The tomb was empty, and the linen shroud was folded nicely. And what he's saying is, it couldn't be robbers. The shroud was folded there. Peter comes rushing in. Yep, it's empty. Where did they take the body? And rushes out. John, waiting there, watches and sees that Magdalene goes back into the tomb. And as she looks and sees the emptiness, she recalibrates her vision so that she sees emptily. And it's only then that she turns, and when she turns 180 degrees, that she sees the gardener. And she says, "Do you know where they took him?" And the gardener says, "Mary." And she pauses, and John is watching all this. He's an eyewitness, the only one, other than Magdalene herself, who never wrote it down. The gardener turns out to be Jesus, resurrected. The tomb is empty because he's not dead. He's not there. He's here. He's in a different state. He says, nolo me tangere, don't touch me yet. Still in process of transformation. It's this kind of imagery that haunted the little people. They couldn't understand the church doctrine arguments, the monotheistic arguments, the council decisions, the scholastic logic, the fantastic Gothic structures. But they couldn't get rid of an uneasy feeling that there was something else here. And what was else here was that they had this feeling of presence. That when they did these skits in this order and came to the 21st one where the sepulcher was, something happened that didn't happen in the doctrine explaining the Mass, but happened for them in the drama. They felt the companionship of a presence that on some deep level they recognized. And so they would tell their children, then they would tell their friends, when they would do these things together. And when they did, they would look at each other, "Yeah, did you feel it? Yeah, I felt that." And over the centuries, this kind of distribution of actuality built up in a human population that were sensitized that underneath the liturgical formalities was an esoteric drama that really happened, and that was where theater came out of. And when they built the globe, they decided that Gothic cathedrals couldn't handle the transformational imagery that was happening there. And that energy needed to have the whole world as a stage. And they built the theater to radiate out. In an odd way, Shakespeare's globe was like a Franklin stove. All you have to do is put one piece of coal in it and make sure that it's hermetically sealed, and it will radiate enough heat to heat a whole house. One piece of coal. One dramatic performance in a hermetically sealed, dramatically truthful environment will light up the whole city of London, the whole countryside of England, the whole continental reaches of Europe, the whole spread of 400 years of history. You can still feel the heat. Not some sham version of it, but the Shakespearean presentation. Devastating to feel the liveliness from a Shakespearean drama when it's performed in an environment that has its own quality. It fascinated such dramatic geniuses as Strindberg, who trying to reach and find what was the esoteric, transformative, alchemical quality that actually works here. And he wrote such a thing as the Easter play. He wrote such a thing as the Dream play. And going to Damascus, in all of these plays, are Strindberg trying to touch that magic, that alchemical magic of the drama. And he comes closest to it in the Dream play. His contemporary, who came even closer, Ibsen, in a play called When We Dead Awaken, which I saw performed once in Madison, Wisconsin, at Frank Lloyd Wright's Unitarian Church on the outskirts of Madison. A magical snowy evening. And when Ibsen's When We Dead Awaken performed there in the Wright Unitarian Church was over, the whole audience just sat there, absolutely electrified. And one had absolutely the certainty that everyone there was of the same tribe, of the same family. We're all blood related. Us. We'd been shown something about ourselves that was so true that it would take a whole lifetime to register in slow motion that actuality on that kind of scale. And one goes out and one is thankful for the silence of a great snowfall, to bless one with the fact that this really happens. An education that is worthy of the 21st century does this for its students. It's just not possible to do it in a 90-minute performance that takes 104 of them strung together. So that one has to learn to sit for 156 hours over a 2-year duration to get the feel. But that feel stays, and it's of service wherever you need to put it. Not as a doctrine, who knows what the doctrine is, but as a performance which you participate in by doing it. So the invitation is not to pass a test, but to show up in your own interest. More next week. Thank you.